Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Let's Talk Astrology. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by our highly esteemed faculty member, Samuel Reynolds. Sam, a former skeptic, has been practicing astrology for over 30 years. So thank you, Sam, so much for joining us today. And how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
Wonderful. So, as many of you will know, I got my election prediction wrong this cycle. And when I talked about in what tantamount to a apology video, I talked about how my political biases got in the way and I think clouded my interpretation. So now I was actually going to go back and do another video looking at the astrology in a new light. However, after watching Sam's post-election video, and thank you to Kay Marie for leading me there, I believe now that's probably a futile endeavor, as Sam will be speaking to today. And very quickly, before Sam takes the floor, I talked about in my video having spoken to an astrologer about a week or two before the election, and that astrologer said to me he thought Donald Trump would win the election, even though it wasn't his preferred candidate. And of course, I can now reveal that was Sam. So, Sam, thank you so much. And it was very, very an instructive video that you did. And where would you like to begin with this discussion?
Well, we can start with why I thought what I thought, both related to the astrology, and we can start with the astrology and what informs that, and then also what you referenced, my skepticism. And then we can talk about the other factors and then, aspects of bias, because we're all afflicted by our biases. So I hope you're not beating yourself up too much because we all have biases. Um, And, there's this expectation, even among astrologers, that the astrology or chart just speaks for itself. No chart just speaks for itself. You can have, 20 different astrologers look at the same chart and have 20 different ways, maybe even 21 different ways in which they're going to come into like discussing it and that what they kind of draw from it and coming to different conclusions. And that's the challenge of astrology in general, why it doesn't match the reductionist empiricist models of quote unquote science, because it isn't as rigid as that. There's always some aspects of nuance and then of course bias. So why I thought it would be Trump astrologically is, and I'll go a step back. So I've been looking at astrologers talk about elections for, close to 25 years, pretty much from just before the 2000 election. And the thing to understand about at that point is I didn't know anything other than, I knew how to read a natal chart and I was doing at that point natal readings. I was not necessarily a professional astrologer. I think this is before I even got more of my certifications through NCGR. So it was basically my exposure on the web, listening to people who I saw as more seasoned and who were seasoned astrologers talking about what they saw and what they thought would happen. It was only closer to 2012 where I started more actively reflecting, had more, I guess, the security and maybe the confidence to start thinking like, well, how might I approach this? And one way I saw was from Nina Griffin, an astrologer, who at the time had her own, I mean, she still has a blog and she still has, um, her website, but she has redone it. And, the initial statement that she made or blog post that she made about predicting elections and the method intrigued me, but that's now gone. You can find it on the Wayback Machine, because I did, and I have shared it, but it's not on her website. So she looked at the 2012 election, and what she introduced me to was a, a form of prediction using the Aries Ingress chart. And it's from Abu Mashar, it's from Islamic Hit Astrology. And she talks through that a little bit, and then I did more research and found more. And the basic idea is that you look at the Aries ingress chart, and depending on what's on the ascendant, you either can just use that chart, or if it is mutable signs rising or mutable signs in the angles, then you're going to cast an Aries ingress chart, and then you're going to also cast a Libra ingress chart, And that's the issue with 2012, by the way. So I didn't look at all of them, but 2012 did have that. And then you are going to look at if it's more cardinal angles, then you're going to look at every ingress. You're going to look at Aries, you're going to look at Cancer, you're going to look at Libra, and then you can look at Capricorn. So you look at those and you look at the rulers, and you're going to look at the ruler of the 10th, which represents the king and his or her party, or the queen. We could say it's the president and the incumbent party. Then you look at the 4th and the ruler of the 4th as the challenger. And from their different positions and their aspects, you can determine what's going on, or you can see who has the leg up. And so for the Aries ingress for 2024, it was 16 Scorpio, so we had a fixed sign. There was no need to kind of look for an additional chart. And Leo was on the cusp of the 10th house related to the midheaven. And then on the cusp of the 4th house was Aquarius. And so that relates to Saturn. And Saturn was in a much better position than the sun. Now, you normally could say, well, the sun is exalted in Aries. Isn't that good? It is good, and it's always going to be true. But the problem is this particular sun ended up in the 6th house. If I used Placidus, it ends up in the 5th house, the succeedent house. But in all house systems, or I should say at least Placidus and whole sign, probably true for the other quadrant systems as well, that Saturn ends up in a angle house in the 4th house with an applying Venus in Pisces to it. So that concerned me in the sense that Venus in Pisces is strong going toward the Saturn where it's largely peregrine. So it's like Venus is, we could say, represents the people in that sense. And so, and Mars wasn't very strong related to that chart either for the sun in Aries. So it led me to believe that the incumbent party would not stay in power. Now, something interesting was happening with this. Now, I had looked at, this is where you can throw in some natal astrology, but I think it's important to know the limits of it. I had looked at Joe Biden's solar return and said it didn't look too good for him. But when I said that, it wasn't so much about his prospects for president. It was prospects related to his health and his standing. So I felt like he would be on a slippery slope down. Now, I didn't go with the conjecture that he would lose until I looked at the Aries ingress chart. And from there, we can see that it definitely, proved true that the sun in the 6th house could have been descriptive of his health. It could be descriptive of concerns about his health, which is another thing that we can take in, and also related to his party. So you're like, well, did it describe Kamala? Well, I didn't see that, but I did see that there would be some kind of challenge related to, Joe and him not doing well. Whether that was going to translate into him losing the election, I wasn't sure about just looking at his natal chart. I was more certain related to his party. So it turns out that it was his health that prompted others to say you need to step down and allow your vice president to step forward. Now, there's some other indicators that I didn't mention in my video that I'm going to mention now. And I also will talk about why I didn't talk about this too much. But I gave hints for anyone who was paying attention. Why didn't I talk about it this much? Well, I do some collaborative work also on a very, we could say, African-centered, African-American-centered website and app called Narrative. And, the lead for that is Karen Hunter. And I told her probably sometime in July, shortly after it became clear that Joe wasn't going to be the nominee. I told her I didn't think Kamala was going to win, and I told her why. And she said, well, don't get into that just now. And I understood that. I mean, initially, I kind of like, well, why not? Blah, blah. But I thought about it. And what I thought about is that there's so many people who are excited about her or who were excited about her. And to be a prominent Black astrologer, Black American astrologer, and be the one to say, like, she's not going to win, I was pretty sure that wasn't going to be well received. And I don't mind being controversial. What I mind being is cold water on people's happiness. And I didn't feel the need to do that beyond my students or other people who were in a closed setting. So people can judge me however they want to judge me, like, oh, you should have been much more, brave. It wasn't a matter of bravery for me. I took the Dark Knight approach, which is, if you remember from the Dark Knight, at the end, he sees the villain. He says, well, I don't have to kill you, but I don't have to save you. And so I took that approach with Kamala. I didn't have to extol her, but I didn't also have to dog her, and I didn't. So I think it would have been perceived as dogging her or rallying for Trump if I had been more vocal in saying she's going to lose. So I didn't. And I kept that, like I said, mainly to, more my inner circle or my students or other people who, beyond social media. But going back to what I was saying, where I dropped hints, one of the things that spooked me, Callum, is the amazing parallels between the 1968 presidential and 1968 year and 2024. You're like, well, what are the parallels that you saw? There was a vice president who steps forward who runs for office because the president wasn't running. Lyndon Baines Johnson decided not to run, and then his vice president, wait for it, from Minnesota decides to run. Okay, so I'm like, okay, Minnesota's in the game again, and that's Hubert Humphrey. So he runs. Then it's also an Olympic year. We have some measure of protest of the Olympics. That's the famous hand rising and things that we have, which was also in solidarity with a white Australian, who didn't raise his hand out of respect, but he did wear the pin. And this is similar to what happened with Simone Biles and two other gymnasts who are all African and kind of holding hands, and people kind of also seeing that as some aspect of protest, but it was actually support. And then one of them was actually disqualified for their medal. Not for that reason, but they were disqualified. Similar to what happened in Mexico, to those two American athletes who were called out. I can't remember exactly if they were disqualified, but I have a whole post where I talk about the parallels in 1968. I should have looked that up beforehand. I don't know if I could find it very quickly, but basically, yeah, it was a whole bunch of things in 1968. And so that also, oh, I have it here. That also put
And
me
for
on.
those who are watching, I'm going to link to what Sam is talking about now, and also
Mhm.
his brilliant YouTube channel where I found the video, and I'll leave all those links in the description and comment boxes.
Yeah. So, I talk about the parallels, um, with, and then, and how folks were really, disgusted by, Jordan Childs and Simone Biles supporting a Brazilian, who won the gold medal. Um, and so I made some parallels to that. So there was just this interesting, you know, mesh of things. And I also was looking at the data. So one of the things I've become very big in is some measure of, analyzing polls and other things. Um, I've moved away from Nate Silver because I think Nate Silver, his models, um, are more driven by what's popular, rather than the polls, and he's not necessarily respected among statisticians. I learned that by reading more statistics. And so that's another kind of draw. I'm talking about some of the other factors that come into play.
Of course, the polls have just been way off in the last couple of cycles. The one I
Yes.
paid close attention to was, I think it was called the Seltzer poll in Iowa.
Hmm.
I lived in Iowa for about 3 or 4 years,
You and I talked
and
about that. Yeah.
yeah, you did. And that lady had been really on the mark in 2016. She was pretty much on the money with the Trump support and going through. So when I saw that one, I was like, wow, that just again confirmation bias with all those. You got the likes of Alan Lickman, who's done his going back to 1984, an issue with a 2001, but still, so all of these things and getting the 2020 election call correctly. And you said to me to that 2 weeks before the election, I was just like, there's no way. My wall came up and my biases and confirmation bias kicked in, and I was like, there's just no way. And of course, completely wrong.
Yeah, and with the Seltzer poll, because I have been looking at, you know, paying more attention obviously to the swing states and looking at the polls coming out there and looking at what some other people I had been following were saying related to the polls. I was suspicious, and you might remember I said that I think the Seltzer poll is an isolation. I think it's a outlier, I said.
Oh, like,
Yeah, I was like, it doesn't make sense, why that suddenly would change. Although things have changed, Obama won Iowa in 2008. So it's not like without measure of probability, but one of the things you learn related to statistics is, paying attention more to Bayesian models in terms of like how you really see things with some measure of consistency. Now that leads to talking about astrology or back to astrology. One of the things I did become convinced in 24 years or 25 years of looking at astrologers predict was that it doesn't seem to work just to rely on natal charts and then compare the two charts between each of the candidates. In our country, it's simpler, meaning that we often just it comes down to two candidates, as versus in other countries where you may have multiple parties or coalitions. So it becomes a little more difficult related to that. But in our country, it is kind of, you just have these two candidates, and the assumption that astrologers will work with often is who has the better chart for that time frame, for going into the next year or the year related to the presidency. And I've come to believe that does not work consistently. I will not say it does not work because you can get, like you said and recited, lucky. You can get lucky, you know, but it can lead to a couple different problems. One, unlike with our clients where we can ask questions, um, and get more intimate details, we really don't know these people. We don't know what happens behind closed doors with in their lives. Um, we can conjecture, but we don't fully know. Even with the president, if we were talking about Biden, we wouldn't necessarily know until after he left office, until, the bio comes out, or like the same thing that happened with the Trump presidency the first time. So when we see particular transits, because that's the first thing people said to me, because I did hint toward this when Biden stepped down and Kamala stepped forward. But people like, have you seen Kamala's transits? She's a Gemini rising. Hello, Jupiter's in Gemini. Um, Jupiter is going to go over her ascendant. This is going to happen, blah, blah. And it made me think about the 2016 election, not so much about Hillary, because Jupiter was in Gemini in 2012, but Jupiter was in Virgo in 2016, and we don't have Bernie Sanders' chart, but he is a sun in Virgo. And I remember some astrologers thinking that as Jupiter was going to go toward a conjunction toward his sun, which was near the Democratic convention, that this would be suggestive that he gets the nomination. And because I also pay attention to data outside of just astrology, I was like, there's no way Bernie Sanders gets the nomination. He's not winning. He's not winning in terms of the polls and also the primaries. He's not going to get it. And he didn't. So what happened? He ended up speaking as the prelude to introducing the nominee, who was Hillary Clinton. Now, that's a Jupiterian moment. It's actually a Jupiterian moment for a Jupiter in detriment moment, right? It's also fitting. But there was this excitement that because it's Jupiter, perforce it has to be this. And we don't know all the different layers. Like, I don't know, did Bernie have a grandkid? Or, something else that could have happened that could have been suggestive in his private life beyond speaking at the Democratic National Convention of that Jupiter crossing over his sun. So relying on transits, progressions, these things as reliable, consistent markers runs into a problem of collapsing natal astrology with, mundane, or we could call world astrology. Now, you might say, like, well, why is world astrology important? Well, what I have found is using some tertiary chart that is independent at least of the two nominees involved is what is often needed. And it's not, their progress chart or something like that. So I use the Aries Ingress chart, right? That's one. But there are other ones that we can use. So one of the ones that seems to be reliable in the United States is called the POTUS USA, or the POTUS A chart, which is George Washington's inauguration chart. So it has been useful, and one particular astrologer, even though he's sidereal, has used this with great effect. Kenneth Bowser has used this with great effect in terms of looking at the sidereal charts of the candidates related to the sidereal chart for the inauguration chart for the first president, George Washington. He did it in 2016 where no one thought Trump would win, and he was correct. And it wasn't his politics. And so that's what made me also pay more attention, because I was like, well, I know some astrologers who are predicting a Trump win, but it was also their politics. The same that we have with folks who do it with Kamala. You might say, like, well, are you always going to disregard the astrologer whose politics align with the candidate? No, but as I got into astrology, I'm a skeptic, right? So I'll be skeptical because I'm like, you're going to see on some level what you want to see.
And I
So
think that's two pronged because again, in my what I would tantamount as an apology video, I made that issue clear that I believe my political biases were getting in the way and clouding my interpretation. But what I found really interesting from your video, and you're making the point now that natal astrology in isolation might not be effective whatsoever. It might be a futile endeavor. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems one of the philosophical points was that the larger realms of what's happening in a country is bigger than the individual. So you take the
yeah,
example, I think, of 9/11, or if we use another example of, say, Hiroshima in Japan, whatever was going on individually with those people as that bomb was falling is a higher level. There's something else going on. It's not to the individual.
yeah. And I was
And
going to get to that point. It's
oh,
called subsumption. So subsumption is where we have the subsumption of individual charts to a larger whole, a larger, we could say, a collective. And so, it kind of lays bare, even on micro levels, if there is a plane crash, it is not likely that you will find a clear indicator for everyone on that plane, looking at their charts, that it would suggest death unequivocally. But what you might find related to, the launch of that plane, we can use like the first flight for that plane, or when it leaves the hangar, whatever you want to use, as an indicator what might be suggestive of what could happen to that plane, which obviously affects and subsumes all the individual charts that are on it. So the tertiary charts that we might use, the POTUS, POTUS A chart, the POTUS USA, or the other charts that people use are the casting of the first vote. So that's another one where you have it in New Hampshire. You use that particular location. That's questionable. Mark Cullen also talked with me about that because this could be a thorny issue, because now that we have, mail or more mail-in ballots or early voting, is that really where we have like the first cast of votes? It's just for that day. So that may have watered that down, even though one still could reference it, but it is a tertiary or an objective chart related to the candidates.
Would
Um,
that speak to as well, maybe an issue with using astrology on election day for the very fact that, many people now are doing early voting and we're looking at weeks and
mhm,
days before the election
that's
happens.
exactly what I'm saying.
Mm.
Yeah, that it's more so it complicates things, so that may not be the chart that we can rely on. The other charts that could be useful, but still questionable, are the plethora of USA charts that we have. So the Sibley chart is more of a symbolic chart than an actual chart. So lots of people still love Sibley. I like Sibley, but there are other charts for the USA that one might use. And then you can also look at the other chart, the natal charts in relation to inauguration day for the upcoming inauguration. That could be another testimony related to it as, something to look at. But I have found why I really like the Ingress chart, and I'm fond of 10th house, 4th house. Now, there's another astrologer who I know. Um, his name is Max, um, and he goes by Blaze on Twitter and other places. But Blaze believes that we also might look at, more competition charts and looking at 1st house, 7th house as well. I have found it better to work with 10th and 4th. Um, More so because we are not talking about a contest between equals. A contest between equals, if we're talking about like a sports competition, it's largely that, like, team at home and team away. But the 10th house, since it does relate to the government in power, and it does relate to, whether it's a royal or it's a president, it is a matter of authority. So I do prefer the 10th house to the 4th house as a dynamic over 1st to 7th. But it's worth trying and looking into and seeing how that lines up. But I find the Ingress charts intriguing because it acknowledges a couple different things, and it acknowledges, especially if we're talking about either cardinal or mutable signs on the ascendant, that things can change, that things go in flux, and that it's like a horary. It's like almost a true form of divination in the classical sense that you're looking at the moment and the larger sense of things rather than just focusing on individuals, which again, the nature of individuals and individual charts, um, in some sense, we could say are localized to more what happens with those individuals during their lives and beyond. So it throws things into question. So, for instance, to break that down, I could look at Picasso's chart now. Picasso has long been dead, but his artwork and things that relate to his estate, his being, will show up related to particular transits. So there's more of an enduring quality. Whereas, like horary and other forms of divination, when we're looking at an ingress, we really are talking about what's happening in this particular moment for the country. And then world astrology can tie in other elements of it in terms of Jupiter and Saturn, especially from the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So that gets a lot more complex. Um, and how that might register related to things. There's one other factor I want to throw in there. And since you also like to do research, I'd be curious to see what you find as well. And I've been looking at this again also for the last 24 years, maybe a little longer as well. One of the things that concerned me, because I pay a lot of attention to Saturn and Jupiter, both in terms of, because classically speaking of Islamic astrology, it is their conjunctions that determines particular epochs, whether we're talking about in their 20-year cycles or their 200-year cycles, when they come together largely in one particular element. So it's been largely Earth, and then we had the transition in 2020. But individually, I paid attention to Saturn and Jupiter as well. So one thing I remembered is that Saturn was in a sign of Jupiter in 2016 in Sagittarius. And that would deal with Jupiterian topics, which I interpreted at the time correctly that the candidates would be concerned, and the world at that time was also concerned about immigration, Jupiterian things, boundaries with borders, related to these transitions. One of the things I was concerned about and even talked about when I gave like the year ahead for 2023 and 2024 was Saturn in Pisces in another sign of Jupiter would bring these issues back up to the fore. And if I were counseling the Republican Party, which I wouldn't do, but I also wouldn't necessarily do it as readily for the Democratic Party either. Um, but because some of their ideas are not in alignment with mine, most of my politics. If I were to counsel them, I would say like, oh, talk about immigration, it'll be more successful for you while Saturn's in Pisces. And sure enough, they did. I mean, they went too far with it. Like, with Saturn cohabitating with Neptune. They're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, that whole particular moment. I think that was something I think that was a concern for a lot of people that they harped on. The other thing in terms of more research oriented, this is what I was also getting to, is that it seems when Jupiter goes into air signs, it usually harkens some measure of a conservative wave. Now, why exactly that is with air, not sure. The only exception I could find in this century was when Jupiter was at last in Gemini in 2012. And that, again, was when Obama was the incumbent. And again, he actually at least had his moon in Gemini. And the other candidate who had his Gemini rising, Mitt Romney, lost. But it didn't come with a conservative wave. What's also interesting to me is that Obama was a moderate. So I try to figure out why that is. But when Jupiter was in Libra, it ushered in, you know, um, it ushered in uh, Trump before. And now, Jupiter in Gemini, it's ushered in Trump again. Jupiter was in Gemini in 2000. It ushered in George W. Bush. It wasn't true in 2004, I don't think. But I think, let me just check that, because I think that was one other thing, and I'm looking at, just before election day, even though things start earlier. Oh, I'm sorry. Jupiter was in Libra in 2004. I was right. So,
Wow.
so there is this thing that happens for Jupiter in air that seems to go with some measure of that. So I also use that as another indicator that
It's really remarkable. And talking about research, I've only really just done it in the last 24 hours. But again, after watching your video and you were talking about the Aries ingress, so I went back through all of the US elections back to 1996. Now, I'm not an expert in mundane astrology, but going through all the rules that you apply seem to say that each time was in line with what you've been saying. And sometimes in astrology, you can just look at charts and the hairs stand at the back of your neck. And I was like, wow, this is so incredible. For 2012, I'm not too sure. That would probably take a more trained eye as
well,
yourself.
yeah. So let's talk about 2012. I mean, let me see. Do I have the power to share? So here's the ingress for 2012. So what this highlights is that it's Sag rising. The incumbent, related to like the 10th house, the midheaven, is at 29. That usually means there's some kind of transition, and Mercury was retrograde. And we also have for the 4th house, we have Pisces, which means that we're looking at Jupiter. Jupiter is solid with Venus. So this would indicate on some level that things seem to favor more the challenger than the incumbent. But here's the thing, it's mutable angles and mutable rising. And so what that would seem to highlight is that we have to do the Libra ingress as well. So the thing to remember is that when it's cardinal, you have to do all the cardinals. Answer in Libra and ideally Capricorn. Although I debate about Capricorn because Capricorn technically is after the election. But technically you would have to do all 4. But with the mutables, you only have to do 2, which means then we need to look at the Libra ingress. And the Libra ingress gives us fixed angles. So that means that between the time of Aries and the time of Libra, and you do it for the, by the way, the capital in question. So between those two, something had shifted, which is true. Anyone who remembers in 2012, in the summer of 2012, maybe it was the I know it was in the fall, but it was probably in September, their first debate between Mitt Romney and Obama. People panicked a little bit because Obama didn't seem, he seemed a little listless and he didn't really come out fighting. And most would say he didn't win. And so people were concerned. And so it seemed as if, like, okay, does he know what's on the line? Well, as we get toward, this Libra ingress, some things have shifted. Yeah, the sun we see is in the 12th house, and you're like, oh, that's not so good, right? But let's look at the challenger. The challenger is Saturn, also in the 12th house, 28 degrees. You're like, well, the moon is making a sextile to this Saturn. Doesn't that improve? Yeah, on some level it does. But I think the key thing is that Mars is rising, so it gives some measure of strength, and Venus is applying, which is in the house of that, of the 10th. Venus is applying to that Mars, which actually can, give some measure of strength and that, some measure of power. Squares are not automatically bad. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind. Also, the sun is going toward an opposition to Uranus. Now, that might suggest an upset by virtue of it being in the 12th house. But I think what this really can, highlight is the sun, by virtue of this rulership to Venus, or rulership by Venus, applying to the midheaven, would suggest that still there's a little more in favor for the incumbent.
Ah,
And, especially they can see each other. We won't say it is sort of a mutual reception. The sun ruling Leo, Venus ruling Libra, but it's not one by degree, but it is by sign, and they can see each other, which is for more medieval influenced astrologers, that is one particular necessity for reception. And you might say, well, Saturn can see that too, but Saturn is kind of more in the waning edges of his dignity. And even though I think at that, I guess he is in Mars's terms, by the way, in that particular position. So I think it seems clear that Obama edges over Romney, which I think proves true. In terms, when I know it proved true, but I don't remember what was the count between them. Do you remember electoral college vote?
I think, let me see. I think it was fairly comfortable. Obviously, I think Obama, he lost the likes of North Carolina, a couple of other, excuse me, swing states as well. So it was definitely
Yeah,
less than the 2008. But
yeah,
yeah,
it wasn't that close. It wasn't
it was
that
a
close.
slight edge. But no,
Yeah,
thank you
it
for
was
this
332.
delineation.
Well, he
Yeah,
got 332 to 206.
is that what it was? Ah,
It was 332 to 206, I believe, and so he crushed him. Um, but he also, he got Iowa. Just that he won Iowa again, which is just a statement to kind of let you know that these things can happen. That the change. But um, I don't know how he did with the popular vote, but he kind of cruised, and I think compared to 2008, I wonder how he did. Um, well, he did. Yeah, he didn't do as well as he did in 2008, which was 365 to 173.
that's right. That's right. No, thank you for going through this delineation. And I'm going to share quickly the charts I look back in the last three cycles. So Sam, as you were speaking before, this is the 2024 Aries ingress. And you mentioned, as you were talking about before, whether it was the challenger and those in power. Obviously, as you mentioned before, we've got a fixed ascendant at 16 degrees Scorpio. And you talked about the ruler of the 10th house. Yes, is exalted, but it's in this six. And you've talked about the challenger being the ruler being Saturn, and also talking about that Venus exalted applying to that Saturn. in
That's
this.
correct. And the other
And
thing is that, we also have to pay attention to Pluto because Pluto is at the same degree as the Jupiter, or close to the same degree as the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction of 2020. And we have a Moon-Pluto opposition, and something that just hit me, with the Moon being in the 10th house, that could signify Kamala, you
ah,
know, and signifying even the presence of the Moon as the ruler of the Sun, that the ascendancy of it. But you might say, like, well, then why didn't she win? Damn it. Well, a couple of reasons. The Moon is separating from Pluto. The Moon is separating from the Sun. Um, it has no connection, related to Saturn or Venus. And it's a while before it can get to the square to either the ascendant or Jupiter. And what that could suggest is that maybe she just didn't have enough time. I mean, she did. The unfortunate thing about her run is that she only really had 3 months.
absolutely, absolutely. And that's a short time to put a campaign together. And that's really a great point. So I also, applying your method, I went back to the 2020 election, and you can give a deeper delineation than I can, but I also noticed with the Aries ingress, again, we've got a Scorpio rising, so fixed, it's good for the year. The incumbent at this time was Trump, Republican Party. So the ruler there is, again, we've got this exalted Aries sun, but it's in the sixth. Now, if we
Mhm.
take the challenger as Saturn, we are domicile here. Now, any extra thoughts for this chart, Sam?
Sure. I mean, the moon is also applying to a very strong Venus. Um, so
Mm,
it's applying to a square. So there was more momentum, for the challenger than it was for, because the sun is fairly isolated, which I think fits. Um, the sun was at the bendings. It was at the south bending. So not only was it challenged by, the bendings, but also it is also in the sixth house, although exalted, having some measure of strength. But it's feral. It has no connection by aspect to any other planet, that could come to its aid. So this was, and that was Trump. Trump was fairly isolated. He had um, lost a lot of his key supporters or fired them. Um, and uh, and I think the Saturn, especially coming off the conjunction to Pluto, is really in the Mars Jupiter conjunction. I think that really is signifying where people were really just fed up, um, and maybe even tired of, the, I guess, somewhat the lockdowns, even though that did continue somewhat with Biden, but also just, just feeling, I guess, hemmed in a bit. And so they wanted to feel some sense of their power again, because I think they felt powerless.
that's a great point. And of course, what happened after 2020. And I will say this is the last chart or charts we're going to look at, but I went back all the way to 1996 and applying your method, Sam, I was like, wow, they work for all of those years, which again is, I'm so thankful for your work and your video that you did because it's made me rethink and it's been a teaching lesson for me. So this was the 2016 US election. In the Aries ingress, we have a mutable ascendant. So as you've talked about, I also went to look at the Libra ingress. And going over, we can get back to the Aries one, but looking at the Libra ingress, I noticed that we've got the incumbent, the ruler there is in fall in the 12th. And if we look at the ruler of the fourth for the challenger, we've got Saturn. I think you mentioned this before, Saturn in Sagittarius in the
Hmm.
second. So your thoughts on these charts, Sam?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I hadn't looked at it that way. So,
Hmm.
we just talked about, Trump being his son at the bendings, whereas with the Libra ingress chart, Saturn is at the north bending. So, and how I do this, if people are curious, I put the north node at the ascendant. I bring him down, and whatever planet is moved and square to him, when it's going into the bottom half of the chart, that's the north, right? That's the north bending. That's how I know north from south in terms of that. So Saturn has a trine to the midheaven Let's see what else he has a connection with. He has a square with Neptune. So I don't know if that's so much about deception or kind of more like, you know, underestimating. But Moon is coming off a opposition to him, which might say like, well, is that suggestive too late? But the sun is going toward a conjunction to Jupiter, but in the 12th. I don't think that Moon is doing anything else except going to Venus. And let me see, what else is she touching? I think that's, well, she's going to have an opposition to Mars, which is cohabitating with Saturn. And I think what that might suggest, that opposition is kind of more of a boon, I think, to some degree for the Challenger because it's cohabitating with Saturn in that particular position, in Sagittarius. So I would be more inclined to think what happened, which is that she got the popular vote, Sun Jupiter, but that Sun wasn't in a very strong position, either in essential or accidental dignity. And Saturn is more succeedent and better positioned by virtue of being in the second house, um, and having a trine to the ascendant, being at the north bending. I think he just had a stronger placement. And that would be more suggestive of the challenger than the incumbent. And you're like, well, Hillary wasn't the president. No, she was not the president, but she was for the incumbent party.
Incumbent party. And I think that was a really important point you made in the video. So I applied that looking back all the way back again to 1996. And again, I was just, my mind was blown. I was like, wow, this is, it's a great teaching moment because I was like, wow, this is probably what I'm going to do looking forward. And I'm just going to not look at natal interpretations, whether it's the solar returns, progressions, da 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 da. And I was very thankful for your words of wisdom in this.
Well, thank you. And I do want to tell people, because
Mm.
people might look at this 4 years from now, like it didn't work. Nothing in astrology works every time, right? But what you're looking for is what works much of the time, if not most of the time. And so, in you looking back to 1996, it still works better than where we kind of like, infuse our biases related to looking at natal charts as determining what's happening on a mundane level. Because this is so much more about literally the mundane chart for a country, looking at the capital. And I think that is something to kind of understand and use. So for instance, I'll do it right on the spot. I looked at well, I won't do it on the spot now because I probably have to look at all these other factors and we're going toward our time. But I looked at the election in India for Modi, Narendra Modi. A friend asked me to look at it, and I'm concerned about my friends in India, and I know something about the BJP, Modi's party. But I was just looking at it, and I wrote to them. I'll tell you because I have it here. Um, what I said to him. Hey there, here's my prediction. The incumbent party holds, unfortunately, revealing a little bit of my politics in his, but they lose some seats and power. Modi is still very beloved, and many are upset with his party. I saw that, hence losing some seats. This is the beginning of an end, but I don't believe it is an end. Let's see how this proves true on the 4th. And he wrote me, results are out. You were bang on. You were right. You were
Yeah, yeah.
right
And
on it.
I remember that myself. And as you said, it's still they won power, but they lost a number of seats. I'm not too familiar with Indian politics, but yeah, that was absolutely bang on. And you use the same. Did you
Same
use any other
technique, and I do
techniques?
it for
Just
June 3rd.
Aries Ingress?
Yeah. Yep. Yep. So he said the results are June 4th. And so he wrote me just to, remind me on May 30th. So I got to it on Monday the 3rd. And sure enough, we learned that, it was.
Wow.
So I know it works, um, and works with more consistency. And that's what we're looking for.
Right.
And I
Right.
think with natal charts, and this is especially true for the student, you know, you you start reading these political figures like you would read a client or your brother-in-law or your friend, And there's details you will know related to their lives that you're not going to know for these candidates. And so you can get caught up more based on your bias, which is what and what you're exposed to, rather than the parts you don't know. The benefit of a chart like the Ingress chart, it's speaking apart from nativity. It's speaking more related to the country, and I think it taps into a key aspect of divination, which I think is at the heart of astrology. But that's a longer discussion. And I think some measure you might say, well, why do we get so much into natal? Well, with the advent of psychological astrology, which I think has largely been a good thing, in emphasizing our own psychological development related to understanding a chart, I think it can become, like anything, overused, right? Um, and so we got into this habit of trying to understand candidates and understand what's happening in our world just through personality and then what's happening in the person. Whereas there are things that are happening that are way beyond the person. Trump is an instrument, as was Kamala, um, an instrument of their times.
Absolutely brilliant. So again, thank you, Sam, so much for sharing your brilliant insights. And I learned so much through your work and what you do. And I will say to people who commented on the last video, I know there was many of you talked about mundane astrology and the Aries ingresses. So I think it just speaks to what you guys were saying as well. So I'm definitely changing my whole philosophy moving forward. So Sam, for you, what's coming up for you right now? How can people
Oh,
reach you?
sure. Yeah. I also want to give credit to some other people who
Hmm.
have been talking about this. So, Gary Caton, I think he's taught at Kepler. Gary Caton, sky astrologer, had similar results using the same method, and has been for a while. Uh, and then also Ali Alomi, Dr. Ali Alomi, who's on Twitter, also has a Patreon, Heads on History, has been talking about Islamic astrology. So I want to give props to them because when I couldn't remember some aspects of the technique, because I was lucky in terms of looking at the fixed ascendant and being like, I remembered that. When it's fixed, I don't have to do anything else. But I couldn't remember the detail related to what you switch with cardinal or mutable. And so they were helpful in terms of also reminding me about the details related to that and other
And
techniques
I think you
and things.
mentioned well Nina Griffin because I think she's done
Nina
work at
Griffin.
Kepler as well,
Yep,
going on there
Nina
as well. Mm.
also. So I want to always give props to my colleagues who are doing that work, and so other people can look to them as well in terms of fleshing out more related to technique. As for what I'm doing, um, people can reach me at unlockastrology.com. I'm happily teaching at Kepler this semester, my first semester at Kepler, after years of also teaching at IAA, the International Academy of Astrology. Um, I am also going to be at NORWAC, coming up in May. Also, I would encourage people to go to the WSAA, the Washington State Astrological Association, because I'm excited about doing a talk in March about the astrology of enemies. You don't hear too much about
That sounds
enemies these
intriguing.
days. Yeah, right. So I'm going to be talking about, how to deal with enemies. So that's in March. I'm blanking on the dates right now,
I've
but
I've
people can.
got I've got Mars and Aries in the seventh, so
Okay, open enemies. Yeah, you deal with that. I'm going to talk about what to do with that, and also, give a different framing related to enemies. Um, and yeah, I teach classes. I do coaching, all these other things. So that's pretty much what's happening for me. Oh, January 4th, I'm going to be teaming up with 3 other astrologers here in Santa Fe. I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm going to be teaming up with Lindsay Turner, Jonah Emerson Bell, and Michael Bartlett, the former president of
wonderful.
Kepler.
Mhm. Oh, Michael. Mm.
So I am going to team up with him, and we're going to be talking about the astrology of 2025, January 4th, online. It's both here. It's a hybrid. It's both in person, and we're going to do it via Zoom.
Wonderful. I can't wait to meet people in person again. So again, Sam, thank you so much for sharing your insights and going through this with us. For everybody watching, just to reiterate, I'll put all of Sam's links in the description and comment boxes. I highly recommend the YouTube channel as well. Go and check out those videos. So again, thank you, Sam, and I hope to have you on again and talk about something else.
Yeah, it's great working with you, Callum.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Thanks
Bye-bye.
for watching.